I'll hand it over to you, Aoife.
Thanks, Beth. So it was interesting to see how many cameras suddenly got switched off when you said that. Nobody wants their face seen. So Beth asked me to say a few words of welcome to the event today. And it's unfortunate that it's online, but I think another way you might get more engagement, Beth, with lots of people being able to log in. So just to say good afternoon and welcome to the Symposium on Inclusive Teaching and Learning in the case studies in engineering, architecture and affiliated disciplines, I think as well. So you all know where this started, or many of you know where this started. So I'm probably telling you something that you're very aware of. But as you know, we applied for a Bronze Athena Swan Award a few years ago now, ably led by Beth and her team at the time. And we got that Bronze Award. And in our self-assessment process, obviously, a lot of what we reflected on was very positive stuff happening in college and engineering and architecture. But I think more importantly, we found out what our shortcomings were and what are the things that we need to work on over the next few years to improve where we are and to ensure that we are a more inclusive college. And so one of the shortcomings that we were not aware of until going through the self-assessment process was that sense of exclusion that was experienced by some of our students. And that sense of exclusion was not constrained to gender, that it was being felt by lots of different types of students across the schools within our college. And so that led to, I think, after a while, the study that we're all going to hear about today, which was on inclusive teaching in the College of Engineering and Architecture. And the objective of that study was to try to create a more inclusive environment and to create a group of lecturers, academics who knew what creating an inclusive environment was and how to go about doing that. And the work of the project is focused on case studies, and the ones we're going to hear today are from civil, APEP, electrical and electronic engineering. I think what we want to gain from these, though, is much more wide-ranging than just the case studies we're going to hear about. And that's to ensure that inclusive teaching becomes part and parcel of what we do in engineering and architecture all the time. And that across the board, our faculty members, whether they were involved in these case studies or not, are aware of the importance of focusing on the principles of inclusive teaching. Obviously, by doing that, what we gain is students who are more engaged and a respect within the college for diversity and an understanding of the different kind of learning needs and preferences of our students. So Beth also asked me just before we get started to remind you about the availability of the online case study book, which is now available through UCD Access and Lifelong Learning. And I think in the chat, there is a link to that from Lisa. So I'd urge you to go and download the book from that link or to copy and paste it and download it later on. So today we're going to have we're going to hear from Connor and Lisa, who I'm going to introduce in a couple of minutes. And after that, we're going to have a presentation from Stephanie Farrell, who Connor and Lisa will introduce. And then we'll stop for some questions and answers, a break. And after the break, we're going to hear our 6 case studies from our authors, all of whom are represented here today. So the first part of this afternoon session is going to be with Lisa and Connor. And Lisa and Connor were brought into their project very early on because they have much more extensive experience and knowledge on inclusive teaching than any of us in the College of Engineering and Architecture could have. And they helped with the workshops, the mentoring of our participants, and with writing that final publication. And I think everybody here would say that their input and their guidance and their mentorship was invaluable throughout the project. Lisa is the program manager of UCD's University for All initiative, and she's edited 2 previous collections of case studies and also co-wrote the Toolkit for Inclusive Higher Education Institutions. And her research interests include universal design for learning, widening participation, equitable access to education, and student inclusion. And Connor is an assistant professor in occupational and environmental studies and has a strong interest in pedagogy innovation, which I'm delighted to hear. He has a background in civil engineering and project management and has carried out research focusing on health and well-being of marginalized communities. And as many of you will already know, Connor is heavily involved in supporting equality, diversity and inclusion in UCD in many different ways. So I'm going to hand over to Lisa and Connor now for their first presentation, which I think is entitled Why Inclusive in Teaching. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Aoife. So I'm just going to share my screen, which we're glad to hear. I only have a couple of slides. As Aoife said, the question is why inclusive teaching? And I suppose from my perspective, Inclusive teaching is really core to the University for All initiative. As Aoife said, I'm the program manager for University for All, and I'll explain to you a little bit about what University for All is if you're not familiar with it. So essentially, University for All is a university-wide initiative to create systemic culture change for inclusion in UCD. So it's looking at how we can or how we should adapt the university to be more inclusive for students, rather than looking at how we can ask students to adapt to fit into a narrow educational system. So teaching and learning, program and curriculum design is the first and most important pillar in our toolkit for inclusive higher education institutions. And really in this initiative, we try to engage the entire university community. So we have a very diverse student population, which I'll talk about in a second, and you can see some of our wonderful access students in the photo on the slide here. And what we're trying to do is really move from a situation where we're othering students, where we're asking students to put up their hand and ask for accommodations or ask for adaptations, and actually to provide for them in a flexible educational environment. Ultimately, we're trying to make access and inclusion everybody's business in the university. So all of us, every lecturer, every staff member, and every student considers how they can be more inclusive in their day-to-day work. So as I said, we have a very diverse student population. This isn't about creating an inclusive university for the future. We need an inclusive university now. So over a third of our students in UCD come from access backgrounds, and that includes students who are first in family to come to college, students who are from low income families, students with disabilities, mature students, part-time students, students coming through further education awards, and students who are refugees and asylum seekers. And a third of our students are also international students. So we have a really diverse student population. And it's really imperative that we look at inclusive teaching. We look at how we can make this a positive educational experience for every single student, and really eliminate the idea that we have a traditional student or an average student. And we're looking to design for all of our students. So the framework that we use and we promote is Universal Design for Learning, and you'll see it peppered throughout the case studies and within the publication and the introduction as well. And Universal Design for Learning really is a framework that allows you to build in flexibility. So we're looking at providing students with multiple means of engagement, of representation, and of action and expression. And Universal Design for Learning is at the core of the University for All initiative. And we've collaborated with the head and the National Forum to create a digital badge in universal design for teaching and learning. So we have over 1,000 people in the sector have been awarded the badge, and over 1,000 people currently undertaking the badge as well in the latest national rollout. So to go back to the original question in terms of why inclusive teaching, well, we have to have inclusive teaching if we want an inclusive, positive experience for our students, and ultimately it's about making access and inclusion everyone's business. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Conor Buggy.
Lisa. I wrote down some notes to ramble through rather than a PowerPoint presentation, which I hope you all don't mind. So Beth and I have crossed paths many times in our involvement with EDI initiatives on campus. And so we knew each other pretty well while she was working away on the college's Athena Swan process. When she found out that even though I work in the School of Public Health, I come from an engineering background and have an interest in universal design and teaching and assessment, she nabbed me to get involved in this project. And when I heard Lisa was involved, I jumped at the chance because I've always loved working with Lisa. When we look back at the past 20 months and all that we've achieved in terms of higher education during the global pandemic, we need to consider what brought us together on this project initially before we reflect on the journey we've all been involved in as the project took place. Back at the starting point of this project, we had eager colleagues that recognized the need for exploring the diversification of their teaching and assessment, colleagues that understood there was a need to update and remodel their teaching to reflect changing pedagogies and assessment strategies, and to reflect, importantly, the changing demographics of their classrooms. These colleagues are all to be commended, as change can be hard, and pushing oneself out of your comfort zone is a challenge for absolutely all of us. As our journey as Ireland's global university continues to manifest at the same time as Irish society itself changes and evolves, we as teachers need to respond on that journey as we attract a more diverse and international student body. And I have to say, our colleagues presenting their case studies today in this new resource have absolutely stepped up to the plate on that. Collectively, as teachers, the only effective and impactful way to respond to this challenge is by taking risks with our teaching and assessment, experimenting with both to see if we can improve the learning experience for everybody in the classroom. As Lisa mentioned, the principles of universal design are like a fantastic way to begin that journey. Evaluating our teaching and assessment methods through the lens of universal design allows us to lay bare our strengths and weaknesses in our teaching methods and how we assess our students. It can be quite sobering to reflect on these. Many of us, I'm sure, think we are good teachers doing our best in our classrooms at a time when higher education is understaffed and under-resourced. But through that reflection process, we can take action to improve how we teach, what resources we use, what way we teach in the classroom and online, and how we assess our students in a way that can help them to flourish. And so even at the best of times, it will be a challenge to undertake such an analysis and reflection and action. Yet the people involved in this project face this and the actuality of doing all of this during the pandemic at a time of high stress and fundamental changes to the way we operate in higher education. In such disruptive times, risk-taking alongside innovation and ideation can bring forth new and surprising solutions that can bring both novelty and engagement in ways we may never have thought possible. For teaching, the pandemic and the necessity to keep students engaged with their studies and perhaps a lifeline to normality allowed us as teachers to take risks and experiment with our teaching and our assessment in ways that we may never have thought possible or indeed had the opportunity to do or even the impetus to do before the pandemic. As the pandemic progressed and we all learned to get to grips with online software and the reality that this online new normal would present for quite a long while, we're still in it, many of us realized we also had an opportunity to do some updating of learning materials and assessment strategies, which we may never had the chance to do otherwise in our very busy lives. Many students found that they had more time to absorb material with it being online. Live asynchronous lectures were often supplemented with more specified learning activities, recorded e-lectures, and more readings than possibly would have been provided. Many of us as teachers felt that we needed to give a lot more learning materials to students than they normally would have, as we feared our students were missing out on their peer learning from their fellow students. We were also able to move away from more traditional forms of assessment, such as in-person exams, in favor of online timed open book exams, presentations, learning portfolios, and a diversity of different projects. This allowed all of our students the capacity to demonstrate their learning outcomes in more impactful and authentic ways than merely just regurgitating at speed in a 3-hour essay paper in a stress-filled exam hall. All of us as teachers and students alike were forced to engage with one another in ways that were inconceivable for many of us prior to the pandemic. Delivering lectures from home with cats walking across cameras, I know this was an issue for me and Lisa. Children and partners and parents making appearances, untidy bedrooms, attics and sheds being used for teaching and learning, all allowed us to become more authentic to one another, to ourselves as teachers and to our students. We experienced each other's lives much more intimately than we thought possible as the lines between home and work and study blurred through the isolation and distancing from one another. We all became more aware of each other simply as fellow citizens struggling through the pandemic rather than as the defined roles of teacher and pupil. In effect, all of the educational changes we made as a result of the pandemic may have humanized higher education at a time when we really need to look at how it's working and what we can do to move it forward. So when we reflect on all of that, we really all must congratulate our colleagues today that persevered with their case studies during the pandemic. While it was neither their initial aim or initial plan that came to fruition, the risks they took in their teaching and assessment that were reinforced by the changes brought by the pandemic can be seen as absolutely wonderful examples of how to change teaching and assessment to ensure that universal design can be embedded even at a time of great change. And so the take-home message today for everybody is this: if you really want to improve your teaching and you want to improve your assessment for all of your students, you really need to take some risks and experiment. The worst that will happen is that they don't work. And so you try something else and you keep on trying until your students actually respond. So finally, just congratulations to the two Daniels Jennifer, Sarah, Miriam, John, and Tiago, it was an absolute privilege to be part of your learning journey over the last nearly 2 years on this project. And I'm absolutely delighted to see the work that you've produced. And I really hope that all of you are proud of what you've accomplished. So I'm going to pass back to Beth now so she can introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you. I'm Elizabeth Shawton, wasn't introduced at the beginning. I helped to organize this pilot study. We reached out to Stephanie Farrell, who is with the Chemical Engineering Department at Rowan University in the United States, because she has a profile of thinking creatively about engagement with students and inclusivity. And we wanted to hear from somebody else outside of our project realm. We've been so trapped within our own discussions that we thought it would open up the discussion to see what people are thinking about on the other side of the Atlantic. So I'm very privileged to be able to present Stephanie Farrell to you, and hope we can learn something from your experience, Stephanie.
Thank you, Beth. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if that's okay. Okay, let's see. All right. Has my title slide appeared on your side? Okay, great. So thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm also really excited about this exchange of ideas. And, as I put together the presentation, I had these moments of sort of panic that, what if we use the same approach? but I don't think we did. So, based on what you've said so far, I think there are some differences, and probably we're going to see a lot of overlap, but different frameworks. And so I'm just really delighted to be here to share ideas with you. I wanted to mention that I have great memories of UCD. I spent 2014-15 in Dublin as a Fulbright scholar, and I was actually at TU Dublin, then DIT. But I spent quite a lot of time at UCD, and I made some very good friends in the chemical engineering department there. So hello again, and it's great to be back, even if it's only virtual. So let's get on with the talk. I'm going to start out with a little bit of history about education that might shed some light on the way things are today. So formal education is thought to have begun in Egypt around 3000 BCE. Education at that time was controlled by the priests, who were a powerful intellectual elite. There were two types of schools. One was for scribes and the other was for priest trainees. And access to these schools was only for a very privileged youth, mostly boys. At that time, students learned mathematics and science, medicine, and humanities. The rules were very strict, and the educational methods emphasized drill and memorization. The earliest venues of education in India were often secluded from the main population. Students were expected to follow strict monastic guidelines prescribed by a guru and to stay away from cities in ashrams. And now we kind of fast forward to the 1300s to this classroom at the University of Bologna. Education was expensive, still mainly for the elite, mainly sons from wealthy families. In short, they had serious issues with access to education. Manuscripts were also extremely hard to come by. To share the information contained in the manuscripts, the lecturer read the manuscripts and students took dictation. So do these learners look engaged? No, look, here's one. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but there's one sleeping right along the aisle there. And then there's one in the back row who looks like they're texting. The state of technology at the time severely limited pedagogical innovation, and it limited who had access to education. By the 1400s, mid 1400s, the technological change that education needed finally came along. Gutenberg's printing press revolutionized university education. Knowledge could be shared. It could be available at any time and any place. Learning could be accessible to the masses. The role of the lecturer could be transformed into the role of an educator. Ironically, the printing press was considered a threat to the lecture and to the lecturer. The Benedictine scribe Felipe de Strada opposed the printing press on the basis of autodidacticism, immorality, and profanity. Luckily, some ideas are too big to be squashed by small minds. And as technology prevailed, it paved the way for the trend towards universal education starting in the 1600s. Gradually, free compulsory education has been established in many parts of the world. Students are no longer the obedient, wealthy male learners of the Middle Ages, but normal people with varying abilities and varying needs. Girls too. People who never could have attended school a few hundred years ago. But still today, in engineering, more than 55% of instructors rely predominantly on the lecture to transmit information into the heads of passive students whose brains are flatlining. 55% of engineering instructors using the banking model of education. This metaphor was introduced by Paulo Freire in his 1970 book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And he used it to describe students who were treated as empty containers into which knowledge was deposited by teachers who were the ones with the expertise. The model positions teachers as experts who narrate facts and students as the obedient passive learners who repeat those facts. Doesn't it sound familiar? Like Bologna in the 1300s? Like ancient Egypt, 3000 BCE? Some of the effects of this sage on the stage style of teaching are that students' prior knowledge is devalued, students do not learn to think critically, and hierarchical values and culture are reproduced. So why is this a problem? The reproduction of hierarchy and the dominant culture is a barrier to both diversity and inclusion. So for example, if you Google successful engineer, this is what the image search comes up as. This is just a screenshot. And this lack of diversity is a problem for our profession. So the engineering profession today is practiced in a world where society and technology are changing faster than ever, where population growth, limited natural resources, and global warming all create enormous challenges, and technological breakthroughs present an abundance of opportunities. To meet the future needs of society, there's a critical need to expand and diversify the engineering workforce. And there are benefits of diversity and inclusion that extend to both the academic environment as well as the workplace. And I think I'm preaching to the converted here, but some of the benefits are the learning benefits, that diversity is essential to the intellectual and social development of all students. Diversity in the learning environment prepares students for a diverse global workforce where they're going to be working. And the workplace benefits linked to increases in innovation and productivity, as well as an increase in engagement when employees work in an inclusive environment. So I'm going to share today a little bit of the work that we've done with respect to inclusive pedagogy as part of a larger project called Revolutionizing Engineering Diversity. This project was funded by the National Science Foundation, and our overarching goal was to expand both diversity and inclusion in the Department of Civil Engineering at Rowan. I'm not a civil engineer, but I'm the PI on the project. My background is in engineering education. So I liked what you said in the introduction, that you are also considering an expanded conception of diversity at UCD. Our project did the same, but we're looking at different groups. So specifically, we're looking at women, racial and ethnic minorities, LGBTQ students, low income and first generation college students, and students with disabilities. The approach that we used for the overall project was a multi-pronged approach that involved institutional commitment, access and success, developing and affirming climate, and also the inclusive pedagogy piece, which I'm going to focus on for the rest of this talk today. And we developed a framework for inclusive pedagogy. It's different from the universal design framework that you're using at UCD, but there's actually quite a bit of overlap in the concepts. So our framework is based on kind of three pieces: the identity development, both personal, social identity, as well as professional identity, critical pedagogy, which is the underlying theory, and engineering culture. And we're kind of looking at an inclusive pedagogy because the academic climate that students experience is really, it's a combination of all their perceptions of interpersonal interaction, their perceptions of what the expectations are and what is valued. And a lot of this happens in the classroom. Through the interpersonal interactions, through the messaging, through the material that's presented in the coursework. And so it's essential to have an inclusive pedagogy for students to form a healthy academic and professional identity. So this is our framework with these three pieces. And this was informed to some extent on a baseline survey that we did at the beginning of the project that showed that students in all of these different diverse demographic groups had very different experiences and perceptions of the college experience. And it was the excluded groups or the underrepresented groups that had the less favorable experiences and perceptions. So this is kind of how our inclusive pedagogy looks. So we focused on the first year course, which is a multidisciplinary engineering course that all students take. And then the rest of the project focused on the civil and environmental engineering curriculum. We had students participate in the redesign of courses to integrate inclusive pedagogy and content. And our team, the RevEd team, supported the faculty in the redesign process. And so we had these different areas of each class that we looked at and tried to introduce inclusive content and pedagogy. So in the syllabus and the introduction of the course, diverse representation throughout the course, integrating socially relevant examples and examples that decenter Western civilization, embracing an asset-based model of diversity, and then using varied assessment methods. So this is probably something that we've all heard many, many times. This is the message that students receive from just about every instructor that they have. When the students ask a question, the instructor says, it's in the syllabus, right? So why not put diversity and inclusion in the syllabus and talk about it on the first day of class? I think, since we started doing this, there's been kind of a trend at different institutions to start to have institutional statements on diversity and inclusion, a lived name policy, and also accommodations. So whether or not your institution has these standard statements, our recommendation is to, put them on the syllabus, talk about them on the first day of class, but also maybe add a little bit to these statements to make them more personal and to show your personal commitment to diversity and inclusion and why it's important to you, and to encourage students to talk to you about it, to open up that dialogue. So the lived name policy, a lot of schools are now have a policy where students can, if they don't want to go by their legal name, they can have a lived name or a name in use that's in the computer system. We just advise our faculty to send out a survey before the class starts and to ask students what name they'd like to use in the class and what pronouns they'd like to use, and then to honor the names and pronouns. It's also a good idea on the survey to present options for I don't know or I haven't decided yet, because sometimes students are caught a little bit off guard and they haven't quite thought about you know, whether or not they want to use their legal name for that class. And then this is something, that linking to your universal design framework, it's good to have a very welcoming and encouraging accommodation statement on the syllabus to kind of lower the barrier for the student to request those accommodations. But it's even better to adopt a universal design approach that will reduce the need for the student to ask for accommodations, because often students don't want to divulge their disability and so they hesitate to ask for accommodations when they need them. So I'm going to use the time that we have left. I'm just going to do a quick time check. Okay. To go through some examples of things that we've done in the civil and environmental engineering curriculum. We start out with trying to introduce diverse representation whenever possible throughout a course. So this could be through the in-class materials, if you're using slides for lectures, or in examples, in the readings and in the assignments. And often there are important contributions, often of people from underrepresented groups, that are overlooked in textbooks and in the literature. And so these role models are really important to students in the development of their professional identities. So we go out of our way to try to seek diverse representation in all of the course materials. So these are a few examples from the civil and environmental engineering courses. We talk about Harriet Chick's contributions to microbiology, Rosalind Franklin's work on the structure of carbon, and in civil engineering, that's critical to the purification of water and air. Garrett Morgan, the inventor of the three-way traffic signal, and then Emily Roebling led the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. And she did this as a hidden figure for 13 years because her husband was paralyzed and he had been the chief engineer of the project, and she wanted to keep him on as the chief engineer. So she really led the project for 13 years. We try to introduce non-Western and non-Northern examples into the curriculum. So a couple examples from two different civil and environmental engineering courses. One is from fluid mechanics, how do the fountains work in the Taj Mahal? And another one is from a materials course, the processing of material properties in Japanese sword making. You can also take, just typical traditional textbook questions and rephrase them a little bit to emphasize the impact of engineering work on society and just make connection with community, connection with human beings. And so a couple of examples of how you might do that. Instead of like a typical textbook question might be design a batch reactor with blah, blah, blah. And, a simple tweak to that question, that the technical aspect would be the same, but just introduce the question with some context, like a developing community needs to have access to safe drinking water and a batch reactor will serve their needs. Instead of a steel beam needs to be redesigned, you can talk about a city that had some structural damage due to Hurricane Sandy, which was something that really impacted communities in the United States. So just the simple rewording of questions reminds students that their work has an impact on society. Other ways that you can emphasize the impact on society is to talk about equity and social justice. So if, for example, in a class on fluid mechanics, you might talk about how water distribution can impact gender equity within communities. So what is the impact on the women who they are responsible for collecting the water, and this disrupts education. And another great equity example is, and they're abundant in civil engineering, relates to transportation. And I love this cartoon because it really illustrates transportation equity very nicely. So it just shows, one person cycling across the tightrope and saying, oh, this isn't so bad, so it's fine for that person. He can get to the other side. But the other people are obviously not comfortable on the tightrope, but then you build a bridge that goes across and everybody can cycle across the bridge. So, just highlighting those examples of how transportation policy, transportation funding, and all the work in transportation can impact communities, and it can either close the gap or widen the gap. It's really important for students to understand that. For assessment, we've tried a bunch of things. One thing that we're doing at the end of every course, and also with our seniors as they're graduating, we look at their perceptions before and after the curriculum. So we ask questions about their understanding or their awareness of the connection between engineering work and these different issues like ethics in a global context, in a societal context, gender equity, gender and society, and their understanding of inclusivity and the importance of inclusivity, and the grand challenges in engineering. And I forgot to put a legend on the graph, but the yellow is before and the green is after, so you can see that their awareness really increases. This is a link. After the presentation, I'll copy and paste this link and just put it in the chat box for you, but we've put lots of examples up on our website, and we're happy to share and happy for you to steal them if they're useful to you. So most of our examples are in civil and environmental engineering, and we're now building out the first year examples that we've used, and we're getting them up on the website. So with that, I want to acknowledge the funding from the National Science Foundation, as well as my colleagues. So Kauser Jahan is the department head of civil and environmental engineering. And I think, getting faculty on board with this and working on the transformation of the curriculum was largely, the success of that was largely due to Kauser's efforts. She really made this a priority in the department, made it valued, and rewarded it. Tiago Foran is the manager of our RED grant, and he did a lot of the work on the development of the curriculum, and he also is the one who supported the faculty as they developed the content for their courses. So of course, I acknowledge all of the civil and environmental engineering faculty who have worked on the development and implemented this in their courses. And with that, I will stop, and hopefully you have questions for me, and hopefully I have answers for you.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. That was brilliant. and completely different to what we had done. So that was great. And while other people are formulating their questions, I have a question for you. I was interested to hear that you've done a baseline survey with the students and then the surveys that you've done afterwards. And I was just wondering if you've done something similar with staff in terms of gathering their perceptions or need for inclusion before and after the project.
We haven't done that as part of this project, but the university has done that. So that's a great question, and that's something that we have included the staff in our efforts and in our rewards and awards, but we didn't survey them. So this was a department level survey. I guess there's only 3 staff in the department, but like at the college level, that would be really meaningful, I think, because the staff has a lot of interaction with students.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, we did something similar in the University for All initiative. So we did a baseline survey last year with students and staff, and it's interesting to compare the perceptions of inclusion across the different areas like teaching and learning, student supports. So it's very enlightening, but I loved the idea of surveying the students before and after the curriculum and really measuring that impact on the students as well.
Yep. I just thought of something. When you say staff, are you talking about the instructors of the courses?
I'm talking about faculty, staff, anybody employed by the university. Yeah. Okay.
It's just a terminology difference. So yeah, for us, staff are not faculty.
Okay.
So yes, we did survey the faculty, and that was very interesting because I think that the faculty felt that the environment's great for students. Because the survey was all student centered, right? So they thought, it's great, no problem. And then the student responses kind of shed some light on their perspectives.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I'll give the floor to Beth wants to ask a question.
I have a number of questions actually, but maybe I'll reserve a few of them. How long has this project been going on, and what do you think the impact has been, or have you been able to measure the impact beyond the survey you showed us? Because and I asked that question because I had imagined changing up engineering content was very difficult, but there you are finding role models that are of different races and of different genders, and I didn't expect that. So I'm interested in how much effort went into this, how long did it take, and how deeply embedded is it into the program now?
So we are in year 5 of the project. The last 2 years obviously have been pandemic years, so a lot of things changed during the pandemic. We were really making good progress on increasing diversity, at least the diversity that we could measure. And then we had some backsliding on that during the pandemic. In terms of the student attitudes and student perceptions, we've seen a positive impact. But we're only assessing this within civil and environmental engineering because that's where the grant focus is. In other departments, we've gotten some people on board, so but it hasn't been like a concerted effort. So that's kind of our next thing, is to try to spread this to the rest of the college. In terms of the depth, when we try to have diverse representation and in the classes, that can be quite a lot of effort, and it depends on the subject, and it depends on the discipline. And so one thing, we've done a couple of things. So sometimes if we don't find enough examples that are really relevant to the particular topic, then we have as students, they do a lot of work in teams, and we have every team choose anyone that they of their choice to learn about throughout the class. And every so often in the class, maybe every few weeks, the students will share like two minutes of what they learned about that person. So sometimes they choose diverse role models and sometimes they don't, but it is a way to learn about people. And I think, you know, anytime you're talking about people and keeping in mind that this work is done by human beings and for society, it's a positive thing. Another thing we've had them do is like have teams adopt a country, and then as we go through different topics in the course, they find out something about that topic in the country that they've chosen. So it can be light, you know, it doesn't have to be really, really in depth, but I think just reminding the students of that connection and putting engineering in context is really important.
As there are no other hands up, I'm just going to go ahead and pepper you with more questions. I thought that was a very interesting strategy about how to frame the question you're asking or the project statement that you're asking the student, that you broaden it out and root it into a social context or something that makes them understand the repercussions of the work they're doing. That seems like an incredibly valuable way and simple way of adjusting how we present and how we challenge students. And you said something about you would put up the resources that you've been using at the end in the chat, which would be really useful. And it makes me think, when we started this project, there was just a dearth of any kind of scholarship on inclusive teaching in engineering and architecture, because it's mostly happened in the humanities, and engineering and architecture just seemed too hard a nut to crack, and so our case studies have been genuinely creative and thinking outside of the box on how to crack that nut, and it's taken a very different form from your studies. It hasn't really been about changing content, but changing modes of delivery and modes of learning, which are all very inventive. And it occurs to me that there's an opportunity here to start sharing resources somehow in a really systematic way, so that we can gain from what you've done, which is incredibly inventive, and not something that had occurred to me. And you could gain from the case studies that our people have worked on, which are equally inventive, but in an entirely different way.
Absolutely, and that's what I was hoping would come out of today. That would be fantastic, and I would love to share. So I did put the link there. Some of the resources are presented more like ideas rather than things that that you can just steal and implement in your course. So if there's something that catches your eye and you have questions about how do we implement that, just reach out to me, because I can get the course materials and send them to you.
So maybe you could put your email in the chat as well, so people can reach out.
Oops.
Anna, I didn't realize you were here. Hi. You have a question. You're muted.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth, and great to see you again, and great to see colleagues. Stephanie, my name is Anna Kelly. I lead the University for All initiative in UCD, and I'm thrilled to be here and to see the fruition of the various discussions that Elizabeth and Connor and Lisa had over the past 2 years. So it's wonderful. And you have brought another dimension to it. And I think Elizabeth is absolutely right in terms of sharing the resources and building a tome, I suppose, of experience, or a volume of experience that everybody can benefit from in the engineering and architecture discipline in particular. But my question to you is, Stephanie, it's very interesting what you have done in terms of your particular discipline focus. I just wondered, has your institution scaled that up across all of the disciplines and apologies, I'm not so familiar with your institution, so perhaps you could give us some context and share that with us.
Yeah, so we did, we envisioned doing a university-wide certificate, and since like in our work, engineering culture has been part of our framework. So we realized that that doesn't apply everywhere, and we were going to work with other departments and other colleges across campus to look at their disciplinary culture and sort of adapt our framework for their context. So we wanted to do this whole certificate program, and we started working on that. And then the university went in another direction, which was actually the direction of universal design. So we started a neurodiversity center. And so they're doing an inclusive pedagogy certificate program, but the framework is universal design. So that could be of interest to you. And I was part of that task force that put together the content for the faculty, for the instructors. College-wide, so this is the other thing, college-wide, I think next semester we're going to be launching a certificate program for the folks in our college, so just engineering. So that'll be our framework, and there we'll talk about different aspects of engineering culture that are an impediment to diversity and inclusion, and then help people develop their own examples for engineering courses in different disciplines.
And how has the uptake been? I mean, is this a project that everyone who teaches in civil has been working on, or is it just a handful of people and you're growing it out from there?
It's been everybody.
Wow.
Yeah, and we did
That's
it throughout
remarkable.
all the core courses in the undergraduate curriculum.
And so how did the teaching staff or the faculty respond to this? Was it hard to get them on board? And are they really engaged now, or what?
I think this is where I really give the department head a lot of credit, because I think she did a great job of messaging the importance of this and conveying that this is really valued within the department. They rewrote their criteria for recontracting and tenure. So the faculty are evaluated on this. It counts. So, and that's always a challenge with work around diversity and inclusion, right? Because people don't know if it really counts. So since it's in there in the evaluation criteria, they know it counts. I think some people have embraced it more than others, but I think everyone has done a good job. And she's really onboarded the new faculty as they come in. She's gotten them going right away. We've provided a lot of support. Tiago, who's the project manager, he's so enthusiastic about this. I think he was also a key to success because he has worked with every single faculty member to kind of do some of the heavy lifting to develop that content. And he has a civil background, so he was equipped to do that.
Well, we have a couple of case studies from civil who might be interested in talking more to you about what you've done. I wonder if there's anybody else in the call that wants to ask Stephanie a question. Well, we will probably have time at the end after we've seen the 6 case studies to have more of a talk. Are you sticking around for this, Stephanie?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, then I would suggest we're supposed to break at 5, but it's 4 minutes to 5, and we're going to reconvene at 10 minutes after 5 so that we can all go get a coffee and walk around and do whatever we need to do. So I will see you all at 10 after 5, yes? Okay. Don't go away. Come back anyways. Okay, so welcome back, everybody. We have 6 case studies, which are going to be very short form presentations of what they did over the past more than 18 months. Say 18 months because that's a pandemic, but we started before the pandemic set in. So they can only briefly tell you what they're on about, but there is a link at the beginning of the chat to the case study book. So you can download that case study book and take a closer look at any of the case studies if you're interested. So we will start with Sarah Cotterill from Civil Engineering.
I'm just going to share my screen.
Yeah.
To be sorry, it's not seem to want to be showing as a presentation. But firstly, I wanted to thank Lisa, Beth, and Connor for the support that they provided throughout this process. I think everyone's probably going to want to say the same, but they've really made the whole experience a lot more enjoyable and have helped us all to learn from one another. So my case study focuses on trying to expand the opportunities for student learning in a stage 2 engineering module. And this was through the inclusion of collaborative group work and the practical application of calculations. So the module is called Environmental Engineering Fundamentals, and it's a core module that aims to lay a foundation for later stages in the degree program, introducing things like environmental ethics, engineering calculations, and fundamental biological, chemical, and physical processes. So in terms of the diversity that we have within the cohort, they span 2 different stages and 4 different degree programs. So in the past few years, we've had between 55 and 60 students, and they've been from a mix of disciplines, including civil, structural, mechanical, and quite a lot of different international students from study abroad, Erasmus, and non-EU exchange programs. So in the first year of the study, when we did the initial post-it note survey, 68% of the students were male, 42% of the students were on an international study program, and 3% of the students were registered with UCD Access and Lifelong Learning as having a disability. So one of the key things I wanted to build on here was creating an opportunity for a wider variety of learning modes so that we could really maximize the engagement between and within the cohort for some transdisciplinary knowledge exchange. So I became module coordinator for this module in 2019 at the outset of the Inclusive Teaching pilot study. And so that's why I wanted to participate in it, and I wanted to achieve a number of different things. Now, some of these things changed with the pandemic in terms of what we were going to be able to achieve when delivering primarily online. So my 4 goals that I had were primarily to move away from talk and talk style lectures and to expand the variety of assessment types. And this was really kind of emphasized in the feedback that I got from the initial post-it note survey, where the students suggested that they wanted to see more group work and practical work, and that they wanted to see laboratory experiments and worked tutorials. Now, obviously going into the lab was difficult during the pandemic. What I tried to do was create varied opportunities for student learning. So learning from the lecturer, learning independently, and learning from one another. Offer flexibility in the mode of delivery. So thinking both about a mixture of live Zoom lectures as well as pre-recorded videos and workbooks that would contain virtual labs or example calculations for students to work through in their own time. So creating some of that flexibility, acknowledging that we were in a global pandemic and we were teaching entirely online. I wanted to ensure that the grading and the assessment was clear and transparent through the use of co-developed rubrics and peer review mechanisms for group work. And I wanted to offer choice in synchronous and asynchronous delivery by recording the live sessions for those that were unable to attend. So some of the things that came out of this, the major changes included the addition of group work, and this was to create a poster, an academic poster, which was built very much on a practical thing that might happen at UCD. So it was centered around UCD Green Campus. And so it was integrating learning from throughout the module in terms of sustainability and ethics and those core principles of biological, chemical, and physical processes to think about how that might be applied in practice. They also co-developed a rubric, and this encouraged the students to think about what was important or essential for completing the tasks to a high standard. There were workbooks that were created which allowed them to test and practice numerical material with a kind of problem-based approach. And some of these workbooks included virtual labs which showcased different skills, but they provided a practical application of the theory that was covered in the lectures and provided context to the numerical questions that were set. So just as Stephanie said, in terms of rewording the questions, making sure that there was context to the information that we were asking them, the question was in the context of an ethical consideration or a physical laboratory that had been recorded. So one of the things that they would learn in this course is a hydropower calculation. And so instead of just teaching them the calculation, I tried to bring in elements where they would think about the ethical and environmental impact of that, as well as how much energy it could physically produce. So the objective of the project was to increase the diversity in the teaching and the assessment modes. And I think this was achieved. The changes made included the inclusion of group work and problem-based learning. And this was reflected in the Post-it note survey and the InfoHub Likert scores for the module. But some of the key comments from the students are that the group poster assignment and the breakout rooms were a great way to get to know the class, and that working with the students from other courses made the groups more interesting. It was good for getting different points of views rather than us all having the same pool of knowledge. So it really showed that that group work and that focus on that allowed them to work in a more diverse manner and learn from one another. So I think that's my 5 minutes up. So I'm going to stop sharing. And
thank you. Sarah, Jennifer, and Daniel, would you like to present now? We'll be taking questions at the end of all the presentations.
Okay. Okay, yeah. Before I start, I'd like to reiterate, what Sarah mentioned about that working now. Everyone can see about the help Beth and Lisa and Connor provided. Otherwise, it would have just been the blind leading the blind to a certain degree. So thanks very much for everything that you've helped us out on this. So, this is a stage 1 module myself and Jennifer have created a few years ago. Jennifer's on the call as well. It was a very long for the introduction, but essentially what this is architecture and engineering students working together, because they work together for their entire careers. So we wanted to see if we can improve the teamwork and communication and understanding of each other through an more inclusive environment.
Just sorry to cut across you. You're showing your preview slide as opposed to the main slide.
Right. How do I change that then?
I think you stop share and you share again, but you just choose a different screen.
All right. Okay. Thanks very much.
Not a bother.
Do I do that shift and what?
Perhaps put it into presentation. Oh, there you go. No. I think if you stop share, if you put it into presentation mode in PowerPoint first and then share.
Okay.
So yeah.
See, a teaching partnership in action.
This is what the blind leading the blind. Okay, so I'll start presentation.
Yeah, and then you share screen.
Oh, I can't see share screen when I do that. Right, I'll just put up the slides and go through them. Maybe that will work. Okay, this view we'll have to do if that's okay for everyone.
That's fine.
So that's a good start anyway. So the module is stage 1 module. There's approximately 150 students. It's core for the architectural students, and it's an optional module for the stage 1 engineering students. It's very much a problem-based learning module. So we've got 4 different projects that they do, where they're all solving problems. The first one being a poster, the second one is a quiz, the third one is a video, and the final one is physical testing in the labs and a report. And we wanted to improve the communication between these two cohorts and their shared understanding of each other. Okay, so the approaches that we took in terms of inclusivity that we brought on board were the flipped classroom, particularly Jennifer did this in stage 1, or in the first 6 weeks of the module, where the students took on their lecture content, where they looked at it themselves, and then we had active learning content where we got them to engage with that, those lectures, for example. Jennifer as well did the teammate expectations, where this is entirely group work, the module, so students had to set up an expectation agreement at the very start of the module in terms of what they expected in terms of work from the other members of the group. And this worked really well. Sarah had mentioned interactive development of rubrics. We did this also, particularly for the first 2 projects, and maybe less so for the other projects. But we had a very much consistent style in terms of for all of the assessments. The bottom figure here on the right is what the rubrics look like. So the text is a bit small probably, but you know what excellent, good, fair, and poor meant. And we kept that consistent throughout the module. The timings of our assessment as well. When we finished one assessment, we introduced the next assessment and let them know what the expectations were, so that when they were engaging with the content knowledge, they could view it with an eye of what the learning objectives were. As I mentioned, it was problem-based learning, and we had lots of active content, particularly because of Zoom fatigue. We felt this was really important in terms of breakout rooms. So on the right-hand side, we have the first image is Spaghetti Tower Challenge, which we did online and worked really well. And the final project on the right is where they do laser cut towers and then they test them in the lab. So we found that students really enjoyed that. We did also include a variety of modes of delivery. So we had myself and Jennifer lecturing, but also Alice Clancy, who was on this call as well, gave a lecture from the architecture perspective as well. And the different modes in terms of Brightspace and lecture notes and that we did seem to work very well. We kept the Brightspace, the VLE, very consistent, so that there was no change between lecturers, and the content and descriptors of how to view the material was very, very consistent. This resulted in exceptional feedback. Actually, we were really bowled over by this. So the 56% of 150 students responded, and did they feel they were able to participate in class? 91% positive response. The assessment strategy built in flexibility and variety, we had a 90% response. Were the learning outcomes and rationale for the learning modes made clear? It was 94%. And lastly, was the learning supported by a variety of learning modes, 91%. So we were really very, very pleased with this, and it reiterated the importance of inclusive teaching. Our recommendations, I'm a little bit over time because of the bad start, but were to set expectations, particularly for group work, but also in terms of assessment and the learning outcomes of the module, to keep reiterating those. We found that to be quite important. Consistency, so consistency in the VLE, the learning environment, but consistency in terms of assessment and what their expectations are of the assessment, what is excellent, good, poor, etc. Flexibility, we had different varieties of teaching styles, learning material, and as we've seen here, a variety of learning styles as well. So one thing we did find was actually they really enjoyed the fact that halfway through the module, we switched it up to another lecture, and even something as simple as that can introduce a better learning experience. Okay, so thanks very much. That's us.
Thank you, Daniel and Jennifer. Next, we have John Healy from the School of Electrical and Electronic Engineering, wherever you are.
Hey, I'm here. So let me try and share the right screen. We've seen that's not as easy as it should be. Okay, so I think you should be able to see my title screen now. Okay, so I was working on biomedical imaging, which is a module that's delivered to about 20 or 30 biomedical fourth or fifth years as an option. And there's typically a good gender balance there. That's it's one of the programs within engineering that does quite a lot better than the average. Actually, I redesigned this module partly based on the tutorials that Elizabeth and Lisa and Connor were delivering, and also partly on Terry Barrett's curriculum redesign module in the teaching and learning courses. So my motivation here was pretty simple. I wanted to move a bit away from instruction via lectures and assessment via a final exam. Now our biosystems colleagues will be better equipped to comment, but I think in general, monocultures are weak. And certainly I was taught pretty much exclusively with those topics when I was, or those approaches when I was a student. So in the case studies, the editors were kind enough to use a pull quote from my report, which I have to admit is not originally my sentiment, but I said something along the lines of that lectures are a medieval solution to a medieval problem, that this is something that goes back to a time when a printed book would be roughly the same cost as a house. And I'm not exaggerating there, that's historical fact. And so then lecturing to students who are then copying down what you're telling them, that this is a cost-efficient way of distributing information. So this is all a bit old-fashioned. And I felt it was time to add a few new strings to my bow. So what I set out to do was to add a focused number of videos to one of my topics, to add some textbook chapters to several others, and to improve my slides in terms of accessibility in a number of ways. And of course, none of this survives contact with COVID. I had plans to change my assessment to a 50% final exam. So that died a death, and our school's approach was to have no final exams last year. And so the other half of my assessment, which was a group project with 3 strands to it, this had to become all of my assessment and to be beefed up. And so everything was changing on the fly, and this is, well, this is always an opportunity as well as a problem. You get to try out some new things, and the big cost on it actually was for the students, that basically everybody was doing that more or less. They were pushing all their assessment into the term, and therefore the students were being assessed over an 11-week term instead of 12 weeks plus a study break plus an exam period, and it was all a bit compressed for them. So within the assessment there, I tried to have self-organized groups, to have a self-directed topic, and to have 3 very different types of reporting. So they're all written reports, but they are reports with very different emphasis and style. So the feedback I got on that was quite mixed. Some of it was very positive, some of it was quite negative. There's some contamination then as well in the feedback with issues that are really down to lockdown and they're not continuing. But I had a great opportunity to talk over what I had done with Bob Lawler, who's a big advocate of project-based learning in Maynooth, and he's a former colleague of mine. I used to work over there, and he gave me some great tips, and I'm running this whole thing again this semester as we speak. And there's an old joke I'll just end on, which says that the first time we run things, the first time we teach them, we learn what's going on. And it's only the second time that we run something that the students learn anything. And of course, the third time we run it, nobody learns anything at all. So I don't know how I'm doing on time there, but I'll end there and hand back over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, John. Next, we have Miriam Fitzpatrick, who teaches urban design in the School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy.
Can you see a black screen there, Lisa? Yeah, thank you. So my module is an introduction to urban design, and it's master's level, and it's core for some students and it's an option for others in planning, in landscape architecture, and in architecture and climate action. So after a word on the introduction as to why I participate in the pilot, I thought I'd sum up in 3 parts. 1, the structure of the module. The second, feedback from the changes I introduced. And thirdly, the implications more broadly, I think, for UCD. So I was interested in inclusivity in public space already. I had done some research, and this little image here of these chairs in Bryant Park is a way of capturing that choice really matters to the details of public space and to elements and signals of inclusivity or in exclusivity. So I was also interested in what Stephanie described as unmentioned, I guess, sometimes setbacks, particularly in design students, and that's of dyslexia. So I was introducing storyboarding as a way of improving and structuring academic writing. And thirdly, I'd completed a PhD that focused on perspectivism. So I was open to a pedagogical approach that might support that outlook. I got great feedback in 2019, and I took 2 key actions from that. And one of those was to give choice in assessment. So it kind of spoke to what I was already finding in public space. And I guess the other was to narrow down all the assignments and to hand them all out at least by week 3. Because my module was an option for many, I often waited to see who the cohort was, and I was making and changing the content as I went along. So, oh, my PowerPoint's gone a bit funny here, but so this is the module structure, and it's in a tripartite structure, and these are kind of like stepping stones with assessments that build up towards the end. So I already had that for my module, and what I did was changed where the assessments came in after each of those points. You know, the giraffe being vertically advantaged, you get this overview of urban design to begin, and then we had field work, visiting the field being the main part using ethnography. And then the final, which has become more important for students, is time to learn about academic writing. And so those are the 3 parts. Because of the second time around this module, the second part here, fieldwork, I changed tack and everybody was locked down in their 2K. So I developed a way where students would show and understand their street. And so from week 4 to 10 in the second rerun, through Zoom classes, I allowed time where 5 students would present what I call windows into the world, because they were from various parts of Europe. We had somebody from South Africa and somebody in China. So we got to see these streets around the world, which was quite fascinating. So the students' feedback was very positive. So I'm showing here the variety of their submissions. Considering we never met, it's very interesting that one of the students said there was no added stress, that everything was perfect, imagine, and they learned from the teacher, but mainly and also from their peers. So another said, which is very nice, that this was a very successful experiment. A number have said that they would like this way of having options in assessment to be replicated in their other courses. They felt that they could present findings in a way that suited them personally because I'd given an option for every stage of the course. One student said this is by far the best of my modules. Sorry guys, they mustn't have taken yours, but also I think it might be because they all performed really well. The discussions were exemplary, the work was and discussions were lively, and everybody attended every week unless they had a reason not to. So everybody got honours in the end, many got A's to A pluses, and these are a variety of, I had book reviews done as a visual, I have street sections, I have various ways of methods of looking at streets. So that's what you're seeing here. But I guess one of the key issues that I found from this was the ripple effect. And Connor described this as a lifeline. So students benefited a lot by having this diversity in approaches to their learning. But also I must say, with the colleagues here, really benefited in having a collegiality. For the first time, perhaps, as a part-time member of staff at UCD, after a decade really running, teaching modules all on my own, I connected to colleagues, even if it was in lockdown, and that had an enormous, buoyed me up. And so in the second semester, which isn't part of the pilot, I was able to kind of throw out that life buoy to a gang of students that you all know returned from Erasmus and had no modules to take. So I was able to take my other module 6 weeks out of sync. I delivered it twice because of things I'd learned through this pilot. So I guess the lesson that I'm talking about today is that the ideals of inclusivity include staff, especially part-time staff. So what the pilot did was helped me ignite, let's say, the pilot was a catalyst igniting a fire of learning. And I'm guessing a University for All might attend more to these supports for us staff. I really think we benefited each other talking through the first lockdown, and we were able to pass on that to our students. So I get the sense that we were all at that time in lockdown, particularly, we recognized this in each other. But now that we're returning to normal, I just want to make the call not to forget your colleagues and our need for collegiality. So thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. We move on to two more case studies from the same School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy. First up is Daniel Sudarshan, who will talk about his first year class. I don't see him, but I know you're there, Dan.
Can you hear me? I hope you could hear and see my slide.
We can see your slide.
But you can't hear me? Okay.
I can hear you.
All right, okay, that's perfect. Sorry, I just want to talk about this particular module that I ran. Sorry, excuse me, I'm still struggling with the screen. Sorry, can I go out and come back again? I'm sorry about that. Excuse me. Right, I hope it works now. Right, I'd like to briefly discuss the changes that I made to this module into practice for architecture students, with focus on discussing about professional practice, ethics, and ethics and so on. And the main thing is about this module is that it introduces professional collaborations and interdisciplinarity to all the students who are involved in this module. It's a core module for architecture students. And as you can see from the lecture schedule, the diversity of the lecturers from Paul Arnold about talking about applied ethics, to Alan Mee and Michael McDonald talking about business, applied business, as well as Emma Hunt from School of Law talking about the connection between law and architecture. So this gives kind of a, a complete overview of what is happening in this module. And sorry, I'm just struggling with my screen still. It's not allowing me to move certain things. These changes were made in light of the inclusive teaching pilot program, which included incorporating diverse assessment strategies, such as group work, peer review, collaborative learning, active learning, as well as reflective writing. Using a variety of tools, that was very, very important for us to enable students to choose presentation topics, what they're interested in, and present their work the way they like to present, including videos or films or drawings or sketches or writing. And making all the learning material available for them online is also one of the main tasks for us. I just wanted to very briefly introduce introduction to this module. This module is running for quite a long time, from September 2012. It started as a response to the project organized by the registry on enhancing first year experience, which I took part. And subsequently, this module was developed to introduce the profession of architecture at the very early stages of architecture education, to promote interdisciplinarity and also to make aware of the collaborations and professional ethics. So in 2019, the detailed student survey conducted by Lisa Patton as a preparation for this pilot project to introduce inclusive teaching and learning. The number of issues were identified, in particularly about communications, especially because the first year students coming for the first time confronting higher education, and they were bombarded with so many different lecturers talking about completely different topics. It's a difficult to deal with. So that was very clearly stated. And the second is the engagement about positive feedback. Most students like the lecture format from where the lecturers come and give their talk, and after this, there's a discussion for half of the time. However, the subject matter changed every week. That made posed some difficulties for the first year students. So these things were identified. And then also that we wanted implemented more flexibility and teaching and learning. And taking all this into account, what I did is to give much more options in assessment and teaching. This is, as you can see this slide, the lectures were very diverse in their structure, in their approach, but somehow the common thread is the architecture, which somehow connected one topic to another. So on the first day, I explained the students about our task to make this module as an inclusive teaching and learning module. That is very important. I think that they understand what it's about, and it was very useful. Lisa gave a talk about the same, and the lecture was recorded and was made available for the students through Brightspace. And I encourage students from the very first day to encourage them to ask questions. It's very important that if they're not very sure about certain things, that they feel comfortable to contact me directly or by email and so on and so forth. So from the second thing was that the important part was the peer review, because the UCD introduced Peer Scholar in last academic year, which was so timely, because all of you spoke about having the difficulty of students seeing others' work. And the peer review allowed us to do this. The peer review was introduced in 2020-21 for the first time. And each student submitted after week 3 their journals, which were reviewed by 3 students and then their colleagues, and then they gave feedback. And that helped improve the standard of the learning journals subsequently. But also, they also learned how to give responds to the feedback, saying whether it's useful or not, because it's not good enough just to say that's an excellent essay. They wanted to know more about how to improve. And then the third thing was the presentations were chosen to, they were allowed to choose any topic they want, that there's no need that to be to do with architecture, because we are covering anyway so many different professions, but also they can think about things that interest them. So that's such a diverse themes were allowed to do, which encourage students to look at these things. And for example, there were architecture in films. I can show you the next slide or the last slide. On that, these were the topics that were discussed or presented. Diverse themes as architecture in films, or the problems female architects face, even though our student percentage of 52% of the students were female, but very less really continue throughout their life, the career. So why that is happening and so on, these things were discussed. I think it was very, very interesting for a first year students to jump into that kind of a important and difficult topics as well. So then they were talking about so many different things. And out of all this, the outcome is that as the lectures and the tutorial were conducted using Zoom, this is just a note because it was conducted using Zoom. It is interesting to note that the first year students felt more free to take part in these discussions using the chat, which I never experienced, to be honest, in live sessions. The far more participation, and the students were asking questions, and this year the same. That is very, very appreciated. And students greatly appreciated the use of the PS Scholar, which worked well. And most of the students took that very seriously and gave very balanced and respectful comments. Like the words, the word count is should be around 700 for that every week. But sometimes the feedback was around 500 for that one particular essay. They really, really took it very seriously, spelling mistakes and making comments and so on. So that is very encouraging thing to continue, at least in my module. The standard of learning journals improved in comparison to 2019-20 dramatically. And the group presentations touch so many diverse projects, as you can see. And the module achieved the goals that itself set itself at the beginning of the semester, I think, in relation to the inclusive teaching and learning. And the evidence that we got at the end of the semester, the feedback was very positive. I must say, very pleased with that. And as a recommendation, I would like to say that based on this case study, I'd like to recommend the following really. Well, first of all, is a peer review. Using peer scholar as a tool can help students to see and comment critically on each other's work, which is extremely useful, especially in blended learning context, or even when we are face-to-face, but still I decided to use the same in this semester as well. And it was extremely useful, at least in week 3 for the first years. And also is ensuring the anonymity is very important. And students should be given more flexibility and freedom regarding the choice of topics they can choose to foster the motivation. And that really, it's really correct, because now we went out of architecture to allow them to choose more. And there's the discussions are far more interesting. They were talking about this year, they're already talking about the vaccination, distribution of vaccination, which has nothing to do with architecture, but they touch a lot of other topics, which is extremely interesting. The combination of different assessment strategies, from starting with a journal and a presentation and giving feedback, is also taken as an assessment, and also giving feedback at the very end of the semester for the presentations the group make, from other groups to give feedback. This all come into assessment strategies, and that was extremely appreciated by the students in the last survey which we did. And make all the learning materials available using Brightspace or similar learning management systems to accommodate students to go back and look at these things are very, very useful. And I think it's a very excellent opportunity for me to start with the module in semester 1, because after having this experience, I could do the same thing for the 2 other modules in semester 2. And this year, I'm definitely continuing to do this, and even more now listening to our colleagues and also for Stephanie, there are more things to change and to improve. That's my part. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Dan. Diego, you're our last speaker.
Hello.
You here?
Yes, thank you. I'll just share my screen. Here we are. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to just discuss this particular module, which is Design, Build, Agency, that is run as an elective, essentially, in semester 2 every year, and is a module where we have a client and a brief to carry out a given project. So in some way, it replicates the processes that the students will encounter in their professional life, for some of them. And I was interested in Stephanie's slide that mapped out the waterline for diversity and what appeared, and then what was below as not something that you would see necessarily at first. So in this instance, I suppose the apparent and obvious ones were that the cohort came from a different background in terms of their education, in as much as the class mixes structural engineers and architects in a more or less 50% ratio each. And also, when we started in 2019, the first cycle, the first step of this cycle, we had a class with, I think, 10 different nationalities. I should say also that the title agency in the module refers to the capacity which is sought from the cohort to take ownership of the process. So that's done deliberately and set out in as much as all the work is done as group work, and all the class receives the same grade, in the knowledge, of course, that contributions will be varied. So that is, I suppose, a parameter that's given to the class at the outset. Also in that year, coincidentally, 2019, the class doubled in size from 15 students to about 30. And that presented some logistical problems actually in the running, which were then reflected in the feedback that at the end of the year reported student dissatisfaction with the subdivision of work. And that is essentially then what I tried to address going forward. So this slide here gives you a sense of the diversity of tasks which are required in this particular process, which range from contact communication with the client in question, starting with the briefing, and then throughout the process as it develops. Design development will consist of necessarily presentations and discussions, and then the more specific stage of production information will go into things such as the sourcing of materials, budgeting and ordering of such materials, timelines, and so forth. So there's also a necessity for administration and for communication to be kept open to all. And therefore there is what follows is a necessity for coordination and the management of all these processes, resources and information, until you get to a point that eventually you can actually start building and assembling whatever the project consists of in that particular year. And the final stage is a report that the class puts together to summarize the experience. So in light of that initial feedback after the first cycle of this process, I suppose what they tried to put in place were means by which to ensure participation, in as much as every individual was, I suppose, interested and willing and enabled to do So this I called choreography, in as much as the module coordinator role I would see as an enabler, which is one of directing but not deciding, and therefore stepping back as much as possible from the decision process. And therefore, what it did set out to do was to set out as many, I suppose, as many overlaps and as many variety as possible in the modes of work, so as to enable every individual student to contribute and participate in the modes that they most related with. So the process starts with individual proposals, just to get that generic investment, let's say. And so there were 30 of those. And out of those 30 associations were made of 3 students with like-minded ideas to start with. So that was back to 10 proposals. And then the class itself, specifically, I stepped out for this step, picked 3 proposals to present to the client. And in light of that, those then were developed and presented. And therefore, at that point, the client entered the discussion. And for a number of weeks, the development consisted of a toing and froing, which in fact actually brought more than the just singular proposal that was eventually chosen to be built, because there were also, again, overlaps in the different proposals to start with. So having chosen that particular and specific singular proposal, then students were actually, I set out those particular groups to ensure diversity, I suppose, to start with, of 7 students. And they were allocated geographically, which is to say to a particular component or place in a given project. These last 2 years, we did exhibition installations. So it was quite simple actually to do that distribution, in that there were different geographic components actually in the exhibitions. And again, that is developed to a point where then to mix students again, a different type of association was made. And this was a task-based association where people were actually just asked to come and do whatever they preferred to, such as technical detailing, or else the sourcing of the materials, the administration, health and safety procedures, for instance, project planning, and so forth. And what emerged out of that essentially was actually a specific group which became pivotal, let's say, in the coordination of all of what followed, until we got to the point of starting the building process. And at that point, the groups reverted back to their original geographic location, because they would be familiar with that particular piece of the work. So this was just a little kind of song and dance, if you want, that people went back and forth. And seemed to have worked, because the feedback was much more positive at the end of this year's module. And this last slide just shows you different types of mode of work that the students had to produce throughout the module. So that is the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Diego. We have run over time a bit. So we have a few minutes left. If anybody has any questions for any of our presenters.
Beth, could I actually say something?
Yep.
Thanks, Beth. And thanks everybody, all the contributors there. Really, I think one of the things I've learned most from this is that there's a great value in this, as one or two of the speakers have said, a community of educators and a community of learning. I've probably picked up about 3-4 very good ideas, thoughts, or suggestions, because I'm listening to people who've gone through similar experiences or have taught in related areas. So it's really this idea, which we don't normally do, of having this community or collegial approach to teaching as well as learning, that I've picked up strongly on. So thanks again to everybody who organized and all the contributors. Some excellent ideas in the presentations, which I hope myself and other people will be able to pick up on and develop in time to come. So thanks, Beth.
Thanks, Brendan. Do we have any other comments or questions? Mark.
So I guess first of all, you know, I think we notice every time that when we have this kind of activity in inclusive teaching, that
Your audio is very weak, Mark.
sorry.
That's a bit.
My laptop, it just fades up and down, I think. So I was going to say that we notice every time we do this inclusive teaching type of practice that it seems to, you know, at first it might seem to benefit a small number of students, but in fact it benefits all students because it's always just a better way of teaching. But I was going to ask you, John, you mentioned in your report something about open-ended projects, that you tried to make them more open-ended, which is obviously really good. But did you have any problems with grading there, or students being confused about how they'd be graded or anything like that? It obviously is more challenging to grade such things.
It was something I wasn't that happy with on the first iteration, and I was developing rubrics on the fly as I was doing that last year, and with all of the changes we had to make to adapt to COVID, that was not something that I got done to my satisfaction. So it's definitely a challenge. I wasn't that happy with my grade distribution, and I had an interesting conversation with Lisa about what that means. Certainly she tried to discourage the automatic assumption that a lot of A's and B's is necessarily a bad thing. And it's worth thinking about that. But yeah, I did find that a challenging part of that sort of assessment. Sorry, your audio's gone again, Mark.
Sorry. It seems like something where for a larger module where you might want TAs to grade. It sounds like something where you wouldn't trust TAs to grade this kind of stuff. You have to have a very good, precise academic judgment.
Yeah, so I didn't have any TAs for that module, and I was lucky enough that the year I ran it was an unusually small class for me. It was 18 students instead of this year it's 38 or something. So I could manage, but I did have to think carefully about the kind of the practicalities around how much time I could give each group each week. And I gave them a lot of time last year, and I think I did it in quite an inefficient way. And that was, again, part of the discussion I had with Bob Lawler around how to manage that kind of group work and how to keep it on track. And so this year I'm spending a lot less time with each group, but because their time is structured a bit better, it's something I can dip in and out of and manage much more efficiently. I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure if that caught the full nature of what you were asking there, Mark, but your sound problems are persisting a bit. Okay.
I think we've now passed the hour, and so we're going to have to wrap up. But I would encourage all of you to go look at the case studies. I mean, we pressured each of the module coordinators to give you a short 5-minute presentation, and it doesn't really do justice to the cleverness of a lot of the work that has happened, a lot that I've learned from and that I'm adapting into my own modules. The whole idea of negotiating a grading rubric with students was completely novel to me. And I had to go back to Sarah and say, how do you do that exactly? Because it sounds like a great idea because they can become invested in their own grading and understand it better. And I think it was you, John, that talked about doing videos. I've not done videos of myself because I keep on thinking an hour long, but you chopped it up into little tiny thematic sections, which meant you could mix and match them later in different years, which is really strategic, both for your own teaching, but also for the students so that they can just engage with a small part at one time. And so there's an enormous amount of really clever thinking in all of these case studies, and they're worth going through. In fact, download the book, skip the front part, and just go straight to the case studies, because that's where the real meat of the thing lies. And I'd just like to thank Lisa and Connor, who have been just brilliant throughout the last 2 years in helping me and everybody who's been involved in this, and for everybody who did a case study and got it wrapped up and done on time, and all of us learned from each other. So it's been a kind of brilliant project to be working on, and it is a project that's going to continue to have legs, because there are now more people who are interested in taking part in something like this and contributing to the case study book. So the case study book is intentionally digital so that it can be enlarged year on year as people add more material to it. So if anybody is interested in doing something like that, get in touch with Lisa or I, and we'll see about extending the pilot to include more modules. But I just finally like to say thanks very much to all of you. Brilliant work.
And thanks very much to you, Beth, for starting the project and keeping everyone going as well. So
I think the College of Engineering and Architecture owes you a lot for you know, leading the Athena Swan and then leading on this as well after you stepped down as the VP for EDI. So I think, Beth, you should give yourself a big pat on the back as well. So I think everybody here will acknowledge that you drove this, and it was a pleasure for Lisa and I to work with you.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much. And I think we're going to call it a day now. Thanks very much for everybody coming along.
Thanks, everyone.
Hey all, thank you.
Well done. Bye.
Hey, guys.